Hey everyone, welcome to the Honestly Podcast. I'm Eric. I'm glad you're here, and we are getting into a topic today. I don't know how deep or surface we're going to be talking about this, but this is one of those, when the concept of honestly came up, this was one of the topics that we really wanted to discuss. And so this is something that this might even be a multi-part thing, not because of length, but just because of time needed to really engage. We want to engage those of you listening as well, that we don't just want this to be, here's our thoughts and everyone else can figure it out. This is definitely something that we're going to walk through with people. So that is the topic of scandals and the church. I hate reading stories or headlines of another pastor being exposed for a scandal. They always hurt. Carl Lentz, Brian Houston, Mark Driscoll, Ravi Zacharias, Philip Yancey, James McDonald, Sam Collier, Tony Evans, the Southern Baptist Convention, portions of the Catholic Church, Bill Hybels, Mike Bickle, Robert Morris. The list can go on. There are so many. And I listed all of those because each of those individuals has had some level of impact on my own life. Those aren't just the top of the Google list. Those are the ones that some of them I knew personally. Some of them I didn't, or most of them I didn't, but there is just a lot involved in this, and it hurts. I want to be honest. When we talked about honestly, that's why we picked that title. I think, I don't remember which specific instance, but it was after one of these scandals that this podcast idea came to fruition. Not because we want to be like so many other podcasts where we're just piling on and attacking or trying to be the journalists, jumping in, whatever. I recognize that it hurts, and it has a ripple effect across so many people. Not just me, not just pastors, not just the church that leader is in. So many people. I look at this list, and I'm not making a judgment upon the person now. I know some or many of these people, I named two organizations that some changes have been made. So I'm not defending them either. I'm just saying the statements I'm about to make are at the time of, when I learned what was going on, not necessarily their own growth now. Carl Lentz was someone I read. I remember reading, it was a sermon he gave, and he talked about calling Jesus your king and reminding that Jesus is everything in your life. And he led me to start a practice where every day I have 2 reminders in my phone. At 1 p.m., Jesus is my king. At 7 a.m., Jesus is my source. That came from him. And I see that every day, and it's incredibly helpful, and it orients me towards Jesus, and it's really good. He's probably the most important to me on this list, but I've engaged with all these others, and it always stung. When there was someone on this list, I found out that they were in the midst of something, and I'm like, I worked with that guy. I know him. Like we're not necessarily best friends, but yeah, I know him. I call him by his first name. And so I just want to take a few minutes and dive into this just a little bit, because I think as we walk towards planting fresh wind, as we walk toward deepening our relationships with Jesus, as we just walk forward as Christians, honestly, I think this is something that needs to have kind of a broad scope conversation, one that's not finger pointy, where we're just saying, well, that person's a heathen, they need to get out. But also one that doesn't say, well, they're just human, whatever. I think that's also not helpful. And ironically, if you listen to our first episode, Jesus is the Center, we talk about the the bounded and fuzzy and centered set organizations, and that concept is probably going to come through in most of these episodes of this podcast, because that finger pointing, they're heathen, they need to get out, that's very bounded set. And then, well, they're humans, what are you going to do? We're sinners. That's very fuzzy. And I want to take some time and take a centered approach to this topic. So the first question is, why do these happen? And I wrote a second question in my notes is, can we even know? Can we know why these happen? I think in some sense, yes, in some sense, no. We could know, but I think a lot of that leads back to, the individual, whatever they've done, whatever they have, inside of them. I think there is something to be said for looking at this both in maybe two different lenses, the lens of the person and the lens of the pastor. So each of these, I think I only named men, though this is not limited to men. That's just the impact, that I've received, has been on me. I think as men, each of these guys is walking on a journey closer to Jesus, hopefully closer to Jesus. And when I think about that, I think about, Paul's encouragement, to Christians to forgive as we've been forgiven. And I don't want to just say like, hey, I'm not saying, what to do in the situation. I'm talking more about the fact that I have my own burdens and I've made my own mistakes. So there can be a space, at least in some capacity, of forgiveness for these people. And that is very difficult for me to say. I've really held on to a lot of these stories for a lot of my own life. And so if you're like, Eric, I just can't, my own pastor did this, he wasn't famous. They weren't famous, but they hurt me in this really deep way. Okay. That's like the specifics of this, change from situation to situation. I've never been under a direct pastor who's done something like this. So that is also a different piece of this conversation. But as the individual, I think, I know Carl Lentz in recent months has talked a bit about his own restoration and how he is still seeking Jesus, and he's part of a church. He's, people are like angry with him because they're like, you're trying to like subvert this pastor and preach. He's like, I don't want any of those things. And so honestly, his own story has given me a little bit of a different perspective. Not necessarily that everything should be absolved. There's a lot of people and things on this list that should not be absolved. But I guess really what I'm trying to say is it's complex. Now, the pastoral side of this, the leadership side of this, that makes a big difference. As a pastor, I do believe there is a higher calling. And when I say higher, it's not better. I just mean kind of a different plane. As Paul talks about being an example, I think being in a position of leadership of any kind, you're followed. People look at what you do, and that's not something you get to pick and choose whether people follow you or not. If you're a leader, that's what the role is. And I think there is something to be said about the need to do the internal work for pastors and leaders. And I would say that for individuals as well. But if you're just listening to this, maybe someone sent it to you, you don't know anything about me or who I am. If you're following a pastor, I would ask, have they done the internal work? Or are they currently doing the internal work? I think the most recent on that list of guys I read their names off was Philip Yancey, which is, it was heartbreaking when I read about him. He was one of those people that I'd never read, but I knew that his influence was far and wide. And then I found that, he'd been in not just a single incident, but a multi-year affair. And, he's a guy writing deeply on prayer, intimacy with God, connection, trying to, push past some of these, massive ministry flaws, I think, that are broad in Western culture. And then here comes that he's, engaged in something like this too. And so I think there's something significant to recognize, for us leaders that, there is something maybe a bit heavier that we're carrying. So that's significant. So, and as someone who is or isn't a leader, I don't know who you are listening, I think doing that internal work is very significant. Whether it's with a therapist, with friends, with ideally both, pastoral influence, all of the above. I think I've been in therapy long enough to recognize that there's a lot that I've needed to process, and it's not all even to the fault of other people. Some of it is recognizing that, a 6-year-old child does not understand the complexity and nuance that a 30-something or 60-something-year-old does, on top of the things that actually were harmful. So there's a lot to that. And I think a lot of these guys are, they need to do the internal work, or even the internal work to prepare for something that, the celebrity level of a pastor that I don't think any of us are really built or made for. We're not meant to be celebrities. So I think there's a lot to that. And I think I would end at least this part of the conversation talking about that, of asking the question, are you or are they doing the internal work? Not just the external, not just building and doing the ministry. Are they building themselves to handle ministry? That's probably more important than doing ministry itself. The second question I have is, what should these scandals not result in? That's throwing the baby out with the bathwater, canceling the church in our own lives. Every time something like this happened, it hurt. But I also have the blessing, I'm grateful that Holy Spirit has spoken this to me, that this is not the desire, the heart of Jesus. This is not the true church. This isn't just, hey, it's going to get so big and there are going to be some guys that explode because of it. No, that's actually not good. So we'll talk about, things to do coming up, but what should it not do? I don't think the entire church should be canceled because of a specific person's failings. I think that one makes too much of a smaller situation, but also continues the unhealthy celebrity of that person. If one of my favorite bands is Need to Breathe, if Bear Reinhardt ever left Need to Breathe, I'd probably stop listening to them. Why? Well, he's the main music writer. He's the front man. He is the main vocalist. He's the kind of the heart of that band. If he left, it probably wouldn't be Need to Breathe anymore. That's not what the church is. If Jesus isn't a part of it, okay, it's not the church. But if one of these leaders makes a mistake, that is not the same thing. That means they are a broken human just like we are. So canceling the church is not the right response. Canceling the church is not the right response. And I say church with a capital C, not a lowercase c. If you need to leave a church because of unhealthy, toxic, broken things, please do. I'm talking capital C church. So what should these result in? I have 4 pieces. Lament, evaluation, intentionality, and intimacy. We need to lament the wrong and grief. This is something that is really very much ignored, I think, in the Western church. No one likes to lament. It's not fun. No one likes to grieve. It's also not fun. But it's also significant that our scriptures has an entire book on lament called Lamentations. I think it's interesting. For the longest time, I didn't realize that those were the same because of the way you pronounce those words. It's not lamentations, it's lamentations, kind of like laminating. And I didn't understand why that connected to my Bible at all. But there's a whole book on lament. And it's honestly just allowing yourself to sit in grief and experience and process your own emotions about it. That's a good and necessary thing. So take time to lament what is wrong, lament what happened, lament that season, the situation, whatever it is, and don't run from the grief. I think when we run from the grief, we lock off another part of, our internal self, and it doesn't go away. We just don't look at it. And that is really, really harmful for us in the long term. So the second, evaluate the situation. Is this actually true? I think is the first thing. Maybe that should have been the first thing. Is it true? I think that's a really significant thing. When I was also very rocked by all the reports that came out of the Southern Baptist Convention, and especially years ago, Houston Chronicle. I say years, 5-ish years ago. All the things that came out with the Houston Chronicle, and they were doing this probe into the broader convention, and there's just a lot there. And I think it really starts with, is this true or not? And if it is true, we need to take proper action, but also recognize that. And I have seen situations where leaders have been falsely accused. So we don't just want to jump on something without any understanding, but evaluate the situation. I think when I say that here, I'm talking about how it pertains to us. Is this my local church pastor? Is this a pastor nearby, in the same city, down the street? Is this someone who I read their book, but they pastor somewhere else? Is this a person who is just kind of a broader figure, but doesn't really, have a ton of influence on me? Evaluate the situation. Is there something that needs to be changed? The answer may be no. Maybe, yeah, you just need to grieve and lament, and that's sad. But then you can move on, and it may need to be a whole lot more. So evaluate the situation. Third, be intentional about what we add, what we cut, and who we listen to. I think this is both related to the situation and related to ministry in general. Be intentional about what we add and what we cut. What are we adding and taking away from our own lives? I think all of these stories, all these scandals can also serve as some sort of spiritual autopsy, though I know their spiritual stories, for the most part, are not over. But we can look at what led them here, and not in a criticizing way, but in a way that allows us to look back at ourselves and say, okay, what do I need to add? What do I need to take away to grow from this? But then I also think we need to be intentional about who we listen to. Are we listening to someone just because the sheer fact that they have a platform? A lot of Christians today, celebrity popular Christians, they just have a platform because they're charismatic. They can command a stage really well. They can gather an audience really well. That is not appropriate. What's the word? Criteria. That's not appropriate criteria for someone being worth listening to. It's like when I always think about Oreos. I think their tagline is America's favorite cookie. Well, just because it's everyone's favorite, that doesn't mean it's actually good. People might like something that's actually pretty bad. And I love Oreos, but they're terrible for me. But that's kind of what I'm saying. Who are we listening to? Why are we listening to them? Are we listening to them because they have catchy books and exciting things to say? Or are they actually someone that, hey, I want to be like this person when I'm older? I think that's what's significant. I don't personally take the time right now to read about church mothers and fathers, but I read people that do. So I'm still one step away. But I love reading from those people because they look at these people in history that you've seen their entire lives. And then you're taking teachings from a life that has been well lived, that finished well. And when I'm saying, what do we cut? I think John Mark Comer's words are very important in this conversation, in that, sometimes we need to slow down as ministers, as Christians, as just people, because we're not made to run at the velocity that we're currently running. So fourth, intimacy. Deepen our connection to Jesus, and deepen it above our connection to any other person, to anything else. And I think that's in sports, some people say the best defense is a good offense. The best offense is a good defense. I think here the best defense against these things is a very intentional offense. If I'm seeking Jesus above all else, and I have people in my life that can point out when I'm not doing that, that is the best defense against these things. It's not about turning around and trying to not enter into a scandal, or as a Christian, it's not about turning around and trying to not do the negative things. It's about turning forward and facing the one we want to become like and running as fast as we can to him. The best defense is a phenomenal offense. And what's awesome is a phenomenal offense is not that difficult to actually do. It's just go to Jesus. Go to Jesus every day. Him first. Run straight there. Make him your focus. Let everything sift through the lens of your relationship with Jesus, and I think it'll work out. So to kind of like end and wrap this, what to do? Don't run from Jesus because of a person. I know many that have, and I want to reach out with compassion and say, I understand that. I understand that. But I also don't think it is solving the problem that running promises will be solved. The harm is still there. In Jesus, we're able to find restoration. And second, don't add to the noise. There's a difference between talking about this, even like I am, talking about what's going on because it's part of life, versus gossiping or ravaging a person, or, it makes me honestly think of the Pharisees. Jesus pushes back on them and says, don't be like them, where they pray on the street corners, grateful that they're not like a certain type of person. I think there's a difference between engaging these things, these realities, and processing through them, and just adding to the mill of noise and gossip and negativity that surrounds them. 3 things I think we should do. They're all similar, and it adds to, the lament, evaluate, be intentional, and seek intimacy is pray and seek healing. If this has hurt you, if any scandals or scenarios have hurt you, pray and seek healing. If they haven't hurt you or you've processed that, pray and seek compassion. If this is just a celebrity pastor that, a friend brought up to you and you're like, I have no idea who they are, pray and seek compassion. That's a real person. And then lastly, it's the thing to do at the end of every one of these episodes, the end of everything. It's pray and seek Jesus. Pray and seek Jesus. Because like I said, the best defense is a great offense, and a great offense is not doing more. It's not bigger mission. It's not larger ministry. It's not more books read. It's not more podcasts listened to. It's not memorizing the Bible. It's not reading the Bible in a month. It's not journaling every day. It's not getting a Bible app streak for 365 days. It's seeking Jesus. And if any of those things are not playing a role in us seeking Jesus, well, then we've missed the point of what those things are really meant to do. And when we can seek Jesus, one, we're able to defend against these own missteps in our own lives, but we're also able to process and grieve them on a broader scale and develop spiritual resilience in our own faith. There's a lot more to this. I'm sure this topic will come up again, but I really wanted to take a few minutes and begin this conversation because I know that this has had a big influence on my own life broadly, and I wanted to be able to speak up about it. So, yeah, this has been a pretty honest conversation from me, but I would love to hear your thoughts, your opinions, your stories, whatever you want to share. You can reach out to us, reach out to this podcast email, honestly@afreshwind.co, or find afreshwind.co online, and you can reach out to us in any way. I'd love to hear your thoughts and anything about this topic. I'd love to speak with you about it. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next time.